At the core of India's engagements with the world is the idea of multi-alignment, engaging with different partners, maintaining strategic autonomy, not being boxed in any camp or alliance, and building a multipolar world. India is using its G20 presidency to further this agenda. India is pushing for what you could call a G21, a group that also has the African Union as a member. New Delhi has endorsed Africa's bid for membership. Now remember, the G20, a group of 20, is an international forum. It has 19 countries and the EU, the European Union. And since the EU is already a part of the G20, another grouping like the African Union won't be unique. But its inclusion would be significant and timely. You see, for years, countries have complained about the G20, calling it a private club with no clear path to membership. Now, the Indian Prime Minister has made an appeal for Africa to make the group more inclusive and representative of the world. Here's a report.
The G20, a grouping that describes itself as the primary venue for international economic and financial cooperation. It's an exclusive grouping that makes decisions affecting the world, but it doesn't really allow the world to take part. Since it was conceived in 1999, the group's composition hasn't changed, even though the world has. The G20 has never inducted a new member. It has permanent guests like Spain, ASEAN and the African Union. But so far, the G20 hasn't given anyone membership. Now that could change thanks to India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has written to the fellow G20 members. India wants to expand the G20 in the upcoming summit in New Delhi this September. By inducting the African Union, the AU is a grouping of 55 African states. It represents about 1.4 billion people and around 10% of the world's economy. You would think that a grouping of this size would be front and center at any global forum. But that's not the reality. The AU has marginal representation at the G20. Only one AU country is a permanent member of the group. That's South Africa. The rest of the AU countries are represented by the African Union delegate, who is a permanent guest, not a member. There's also representation from the African Union's Economic Development Program, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, or NEPAD. This organization too is a permanent guest at the G20. This year it's being represented by Egypt. So, to recap, 1.4 billion people and a tenth of the world's economy is represented by one permanent member and two guests. Let's compare this to the European representation. The EU is a member of G20, and there are 5 European countries who are members in their own capacity: Germany, France, Italy, Turkey and the UK. Spain is also a permanent guest to the G20. So, 6 permanent seats and 1 guest represent Europe, a region with half of Africa's population. That does seem ridiculous, and the world has been waking up to this of late. Last year, Indonesia proposed the AU's membership to the G20 ahead of November's summit in Bali. Indonesia was the chair of the G20 last year. During the Bali summit, French President Emmanuel Macron backed the AU. AU membership was endorsed by China and lobbied for by South Africa. But what came of it? Nothing. There was no mention of the AU's membership in the G20 declaration after the Bali summit. So, does that mean that India's endorsement won't move the needle either? We have to wait for the summit to know for sure, but there is one crucial difference. The AU has 2 new powerful allies this time around. There's of course the hosts, India, and then there's also the US. Last December, days after the Bali summit, US President Joe Biden gave his nod to AU membership.
And today I'm also calling for the African Union to join the G20 as a permanent member of the G20.
Biden said this during a US-Africa summit in Washington. Was Biden's declaration substantial or just sweet nothings? We're likely to find out in September. India has already put its endorsement in writing. Will others follow its lead? We'll keep you updated as this story develops.